Welcome to Casual Politics, George Galloway. This is your second time.
Yes.
Last time it was 2 years ago. It was in your parliamentary office.
Yes.
And now that you're out of Parliament, do you miss your time back in Parliament?
Well, I'm only temporarily resting.
Yeah.
I usually come back to Parliament.
Spending more time with family.
As they say. Well, in my case, that's true, because my wife is about to give birth any moment. So you might get a scoop here on Casual Politics.
Yeah.
And I have my...
It will be the newspaper's headlines tomorrow morning.
And I have a son of 2.5 and one of 5 and one of 9. So I do spend a lot of time with my family, but I'm only temporarily out of Parliament.
Absolutely. You we were just talking about Roy Jenkins. You ousted him as Member of Parliament. Do you regard that as one of your greatest achievements?
Yes, it made Glasgow an all-Labour city for the first time in history. And sadly, there's now not a single Labour Member of Parliament in Glasgow. In fact, for the Scottish Labour Party, it's been all downhill since Mr Blair kicked me out of Labour and then abolished my constituency, just in case I had any ideas of making a comeback. And now in all of Scotland there's only one Labour MP, and to describe him as a Labour MP is a bit of a stretch. Yes, defeating Roy Jenkins was a high point of my political life, and he thanked me for it later because life was much more gentle for him in the House of Lords, which is of course to which he repaired. But I've had many a high point since, and of course some low points. As Rudyard Kipling famously put it, it's important to treat triumph and disaster as impostors, just the same. And that's how I do. I never get overexcited by triumph or over-depressed by defeat.
And you seem sometimes very nostalgic about about the way that Parliament is structured by its members.
Yes.
You used to say that before you would have a pager, and then you would have like very powerful speeches. Do you think that that's changing?
No, I think this is the poorest Parliament I've ever seen. In fact, but for the presence of some quite rebellious Scottish nationalists, it would be the most boring Parliament I've ever seen. My complaints are not really about the structure of the House so much, although I have many complaints about that, about timing, for example. When I first went into Parliament, it was very ordinary to speak and work, vote right into the night, sometimes all through the night. We never finished before 10 p.m. And we never had a day when Parliament wasn't sitting during the normal sitting times. Whereas now they have days off and finishing at 7 and starting at midday and all kinds of modern conveniences, which I don't think are good for Parliament. A Parliament should be more or less in permanent session, because life is more or less in permanent session. And given time zones and so on, when it's night for us, it's day for someone else. But no, my main complaints are about the membership of Parliament, which is overwhelmingly a political class. People who went to the best schools, went to the best universities at the rest of the public's expense until quite recently. And then got a job in Parliament as an advisor, as you did yourself, to a Member of Parliament, and then parachuted into a wholly unsuitable constituency, at least unsuitable from the point of view of the constituents. I mean, a good example of that is in Stoke, where there's a by-election now. Stoke is an overwhelmingly working-class city into which someone called Tristram Hunt was parachuted, and the clue was in the name. There is no one else in the whole of Stoke called Tristram. And no one else in the whole of Stoke that would be offered the directorship of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And that was a classic example of Peter Mandelson, in this case, parachuting one of his chums into what they thought was a safe Labour seat, whether the local people liked it or not. And then they wonder why the Labour Party's strength just gradually ebbs away. But when I went into Parliament in 1987, there were hundreds of people, I mean hundreds, who had been either military officers or industrial workers. On my side, there were dockers and miners and engineers and trade union officials, people who knew the real world. And on the Conservative side, there were many people who were successful businessmen, successful professionals, and as I say, former military officers and so on. So it was a much more representative Parliament.
More diverse.
Yes, diverse, and not the kind of student Parliament which we have today. And that's not just a function of growing older. It's not just about age, although I think we have not enough people of maturity in Parliament, and that's why it's important that people like Dennis Skinner and Joel Kaufman and Paul Flynn stay on as long as they...
It was his birthday today, Paul Flynn's birthday. He turned 82
He's
today.
82, and a long life to him. I hope he's a good thing. And so I do think that that's important, but it's the class and background structure of the Parliament to which I most object. And I think it shows in the quality of the deliberations, what they think is important and what not. Of course, you can modernise the House's business. I often thought that the process of 20 minutes to cast a vote was rather a waste of time, especially on evenings where 3, 4, 5, 6 votes were held. That's a lot of debating time. But all kinds of things have changed. When I was in Parliament, if you wanted to rise on a point of order during the vote, you had to put a top hat on, a silk top hat, which the Sergeant at Arms kept underneath his desk. And you had to ask him for it and don this silk top hat and then rise on your point of order. The theory being that in the tumult, the Speaker would only notice you if you had a silk top hat on. Of course, some of these quaint customs are quite nice. And some of them were useful, so that, for example, I, as a serial rebel, frequently spied strangers in the House of Commons. Now, what does that mean? If you see on the floor of the House someone who is not a member, you could rise and say, Mr. Speaker, I spy strangers. And the Speaker would automatically have to clear the House and call a vote as to whether to resume. Now, if used sparingly, that was quite a useful act of rebellion and disrupted the government's flow. But it's now banned, of course, like many of the good things.
Absolutely. And you made so many powerful speeches. What makes a speech powerful in Parliament?
I think first and foremost you have to mean it. It has to be your speech. It has to be what you really think.
You don't need to go through a piece of paper as most members of Parliament
I
do nowadays.
never once spoke from notes. And nowadays one almost feels they're speaking through an invisible auto cue. And it's clearly not what they really think or really believe. It's only what they think and believe that day. They may have believed something quite different yesterday and something different again tomorrow. And it's almost certain that they were given it to speak. They were told that's what they thought and what they believed. And it shows. So, for example, we were talking about Mr. Skinner. He and I both made contributions on the death of Mrs. Thatcher. And most of it was robotic, ritualistic, fawning, whilst Mr. Skinner and I said what we really thought. And if you, as historians might, look back on that debate on the death of Mrs. Thatcher, I think it's his speech and mine that will stand out.
Absolutely. And when Tam Dalo passed away, you described him the last giant in British politics. I remember last time when I interviewed Dennis Healy, it was 2.5 years ago, and then when I asked him about Tam Daley, he told me that he was never prepared for compromise for the sake of party unity. Did you ever believe actually in party unity yourself?
Well, not this party, not a unity around the policies that this party has been following. In another context, with another party, in other circumstances, I would. But there has to, if a parliament is to be worthy of the name, it has to have space for contrary views, even within parties. Because after all, think of what Mr. Healy, whom I greatly respected, think of what he's really saying there. He's really saying that Mr. DL should pretend to believe something that he doesn't believe. Now, Tam DL used to infuriate me when I didn't agree with him. For example, on the question of Scottish devolution, he was a giant thorn in the side of the issue of Scottish devolution, and quite often when he would rise and throw spanners in the works, I would be irritated. But I like to think I always checked my irritation and balanced it against the possibility that he might be right and I might be wrong. I'm not yet ready to say he was right on that subject, though I'm ready to say he was more right than we at that time imagined. But he was absolutely right on things that Mr. Healy was absolutely wrong about, namely the Falklands War, other wars, other policies. Mr. DL was right and Mr. Healy was wrong. And what Mr. Healy would have been asking Dalyell to do was pretend that he thought Mr. Healy was right, when in truth he believed he was wrong. And that's no kind of parliament. A parliament has to be men and women of independent mind. And when I entered parliament in 1987, it was. It had many giant figures in it. And when they rose, you genuinely didn't know what they were going to say, what line they were going to take. They might support their own leadership. On the other hand, they might not. But you knew that whatever it was they had to say was worth hearing. And you wouldn't dream of going out for an egg sandwich when Mr. Healy rose, or Mr. DL rose. And therefore, they were valuable parliamentarians.
And when you first entered into Parliament, your first Speaker of the House, it was Bernard Wetherill. And Dennis Skinner once told me that he would always wear a thimble and representative of where he came from. And do you think that now we have John Bercow, do you think that he represents like the working class majority in the House of Parliament? No,
and I think I no longer have to feign respect for John Bercow, and I have none. The descent, the decline from Bernard Wetherill to John Bercow mimics the descent of parliamentary standards that I'm talking about. Bernard Wetherill was a tailor. There's a wonderful story, not I think apocryphal, that Mr. Wetherill was in the WC in Parliament, and he could hear two men outside the door talking about him. And one grand Tory said to the other, I don't know what's happening here. I've just discovered my tailor is now in here as a member of Parliament. And that was Wetherill. And that's why he had a thimble, because he had been a tailor. But Wetherill was a pretty pristine example of what a speaker should be. And John Bercow is a vulgar little oik. And it shows. And it's a sign, a symbol of how Parliament has declined in our national life.
And do you think that he breached the parliamentary privileges by announcing that he wouldn't welcome Mr. Trump?
He did, absolutely, and you couldn't imagine Bernard Wetherill doing anything like that. It was pure grandstanding, a parade of political correctness, quite beyond his powers, absolutely unmindful of the equal power that Norman Fowler, as the Speaker of the House of Lords and joint custodian of joint parliamentary addresses, He wasn't even consulted or told about this ex cathedra announcement by Bercow. And of course, absolutely unmindful of the fact that it was the Queen who invited Trump to Britain. So what he was actually saying was, he might be good enough to be a guest of the Queen in Buckingham Palace, but he's not good enough to be the guest of John Bercow, which is definitely a lèse-majesté.
Absolutely. But what do you make yourself? What do you make of Trump's ban on 7 Muslim countries yourself?
It's extremely foolish and dangerous. It's foolish.
Would it incite violence?
Yes, it will make more extremism. And it's completely unnecessary. It was unnecessary when Barack Obama drew up the list of 7 countries, and unnecessary when Donald Trump implemented it, because every state has the right to decide who can come into its country, and it's only common sense that that decision is made person by person, case by case. You can't say that everyone in such and such a country is a security risk, and so you shouldn't try to do so with a blanket ban such as this. It's also foolish because the mainly Muslim countries that generate most of the terrorism are not on the list.
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia would be at the top of any list of countries from which terrorism is likely to emanate, but it's not on the list. Nor Egypt, nor Pakistan. These are all off, whilst other countries are all on, and that's just foolish. And it's dangerous because, as I say, it will create more extremism. It will put more chips of grievance on more shoulders. And it was grievance that got us where we are. It was the feeling of grievance about double standards and injustice that led to the fanatic extremists spreading all over the world in the first place.
And because you yourself, you were a Brexiter in prior to the referendum, but do you think that Mr. Trump, he would be beneficial to us because he said that he would go at the front of the queue?
Well, I think you need to imagine 10-foot high letters if. If Donald Trump does what he said he would do, then he'll be a good president for us, and more importantly for America. But there's a big if there. If he makes peace with Russia, turns down the dial of hostility in international affairs between the United States and Russia, if he dampens the enthusiasm of NATO for its war games on the Russian border, if he throws himself wholeheartedly into the struggle against ISIS and Al-Qaeda, as he said he would do, and make alliances with others who are fighting them, that'll be very good for the world. If he combats globalization, the anonymous, invisible, unaccountable, unelected, irremovable, blind forces of capital from people's lives, he'll be doing a good thing. If he protects American industry and workers and manufacturers, he'll be doing a good thing for America and he'll be re-elected. But there is a big if in all of those statements. And time will tell. He's only been in a few weeks.
And do you think that we are diminishing as a world power, regardless of the Brexit vote?
Well, I hope so. Who wants to be a world power when you are a small island off the mainland of Europe with 60 million people?
Well, when you see like Russia reinforcing its powers.
It's an absurd and ludicrous illusion that we are a world power. In what sense are we a world power? It's bitterly cold outside and our pensioners will be dying of cold. We can't make our trains run on time. Sometimes we can't make our trains run at all. Our students have to pay almost £10,000 to go to the university for a year. We have millions of children living in poverty. We've got food banks everywhere. We've got the best defended food banks in the world, defended by nuclear weapons. This world power nonsense has to stop. It's one of the reasons why Britain gets into one mess after another, one jam after another. Let's attend to our own problems here at home. There are plenty of them. And let our politicians be preoccupied with those problems instead of strutting around the world threatening people with America's army. Because America's army isn't actually available to us any longer. It may very well be that America's army doesn't see things, or at least its commander-in-chief, doesn't see things the way our political leaders see them. So I don't want to be a world power. I hate the notion of us as a world power. We, from that little building that I sat in for almost 30 years, we ruled a third of the world's land mass and a quarter of the world's humanity. And I'm ashamed of that, not proud of it.
And what role do you foresee for Britain to play following the Brexit vote?
Well, I think Britain can become the centre of the world. You're far too young to know this, but once upon a time, London was a very swinging, happening place.
In the 70s.
All roads led to London. In the 60s, before we joined the European Union, Britain was something in the world. It was a cultural power in the world. And that's the kind of Britain I want to see. I think it was our golden era, actually. If I was to name a short decade, it would be that. It would be roughly 1964 to 1970, I would say. That was when Britain was still a major manufacturer, making the Mini, making the Jaguar, making hovercraft, inventing and
the
making
white heat of technology
hovercraft.
was happening.
Indeed, the white hot heat of the technological revolution. We were at the centre of it, and we had a soft power, cultural power of phenomenal proportions, and that's what I'd like to do again.
And 2 years ago, when I asked you whether you were in favour of us staying within the EU, you said yes, you would prefer us to. So what changed your mind? What caused you to change your mind?
Greece.
Like Greece.
The crushing of the people of Greece was when I made a public announcement that I could no longer support the European Union and I could no longer ask anyone else to do so. I had, in 1973, been one of the campaigners, 75 rather, one of the campaigners against joining the then European Community, EEC, under Mr. Ben and Mr. Foote and others. But by the time of the crushing of Greece, it became simply unconscionable to countenance any further membership of the European Union. If we got the chance to vote ourselves out, at the time we spoke, we weren't really sure that we would ever have such a referendum. But when one came, there was only one thing I could do. Of course, my opposition to the EU is for completely different reasons to the opposition of some others. And it was a binary referendum, in or out, yes or no. You couldn't choose your allies on either side. So you shouldn't hold me responsible for the point of view of others who were urging the same course of action, any more than I should accuse Remainers of being followers of Tony Blair. I know that that would be a very big insult to most people.
Now that we triggered Article 50, some people, and we need a strong opposition, but some people fear that we're not having that strong opposition in Parliament because of the of your friend Mr. Corbyn's leadership, because they fear that he's not supported, and we saw yesterday that 52 MPs, they rebelled against him. So what do you make of his leadership, and do you believe in strong leadership as leader of the opposition?
Well, that represents a very substantial improvement in Mr. Corbyn's position, because only last summer 172 Labour MPs voted no confidence in him. So only 52 had no confidence in him in the lobbies the other night. That's, by my reckoning, a very substantial improvement in his position. I wouldn't, if I were the leader of the Labour Party, lead it in the same way as Mr Corbyn has.
In what ways?
Because I'm not him and he's not me. And I could never have been the leader of the Labour Party, and he is. And the reason he is the leader is the reason, or are some of the reasons, why his performance can be criticised in some respects. So that, for example, as he said himself, he's a very lenient person. I'm not a very lenient person. He, having spent his whole life opposing the EU, was part of the campaign for Remain. I think that was a mistake. He should have done what Mr Wilson did in 1975 and declared that it was a free vote and every member of the Labour Party could campaign for their own point of view. And if he had done so and made it clear that he had always been against membership of the EU, he would now be reaping the electoral dividends of the Brexit vote. As it is, he's been principled. He's said, whatever our point of view, the people have spoken, therefore blocking Article 50 is completely undemocratic and unacceptable. And it's a pity that even 52 Labour MPs can't see that.
But you said having a free vote, but Wilson, he was in power when he imposed like a free vote when he was in opposition. When we joined the European Community back in 1972, he also, like Mr Corbyn, to Mr Corbyn's credit, he imposed a three-line whip.
He did, and 77 Labour MPs led by Roy Jenkins, broke the three-line whip. Absolutely. So the European question is a fault line in British politics and has been since the 1960s. So inevitably, party management over the EU has been historically difficult for both political parties, or even the Liberal Democrats. I hesitate to bring them up, they're relatively insignificant nowadays, but 22% of their party MPs abstained last night, this week. So it's a knotty and intractable issue for everybody. And that's why, if I had been in Mr Corbyn's shoes, I would have said, well, everybody knows I'm against the EU, but I also recognise that many Labour members are for it. So we'll have a free vote and everyone's free to campaign for their own point of view. And if he had done that, and if he had campaigned, he'd now be, not UKIP, he'd be the #1 beneficiary of the Brexit vote.
And you've been very critical of some of BBC's commentators like Laura Kunsberg about his leadership. So why do you think that BBC, they've been biased and against Mr Corbyn's leadership?
Well, it's not just me who says that, it's the Board of Trustees of the BBC who have had an investigation into Laura Kunsberg's treatment of Jeremy Corbyn and found her wanting and falling short of the standards and protocols of the BBC. A blind man could see how biased BBC politics is against Jeremy Corbyn. Now that's completely unacceptable, and I mean that literally. It is not to be accepted, because whilst Mr Murdoch or any other private media mogul is fully entitled to have whatever political point of view they like. It's their money, it's their station, they can do with it as they will. But the BBC is our money and our station and has a statutory legal responsibility to be politically balanced. And balanced they most definitely are not. You can see it on the Daily Politics, but you can see it even more starkly on BBC Question Time, which has become a weekly kickabout of Jeremy Corbyn. Very frequently, not one member of the panel has any intention of defending Jeremy Corbyn, and the audience selection is rigged. I know that personally. So this is completely unacceptable. This is a flagship British Broadcasting Corporation programme, paid for by our money, very expensively. We pay the people at Question Time a lot of money. We pay David Dimbleby more than £1 million every year from public funds, and he has a public duty and he's not discharging it. And it's time for David Dimbleby to go, in my view. And he'd be better replaced by Andrew Neil, who is just as right-wing, just as conservative, and who would give Jeremy Corbyn a hard time. The difference is Andrew Neil gives everybody a hard time.
Equally to everybody.
I've known him for 40 years and he gives me a hard time. And he gives people that he agrees with a hard time. That's what we want from BBC Politics. Not this kind of conspiratorial. I mean, Laura Kuenssberg conspires with people to create news to use against Jeremy Corbyn. She's been caught doing so, and more than once. So this is completely unacceptable, and I don't believe that the opposition should put up with it.
And following the Brexit vote in Parliament, some political commentators, they said that that Tories, now they're united, and it's on the Labour side that we're seeing disunity. And following Mr. Lewis's resignation yesterday from the shadow cabinet, do you think is that actually true?
Well, I think that Lewis's resignation was a premeditated starter gun for another challenge against Jeremy Corbyn. This time from his supposed allies, though I don't believe that Mr. Lewis has ever been a genuine ally of Jeremy Corbyn over the Trident vote and sotto voce comments by his supporters, Owen Smith and, Owen Jones, I keep getting them mixed up, unaccountably, Owen Jones and Paul Mason. They've been intriguing to install Clive Lewis as the leader in Jeremy Corbyn's stead for a very long time. So for the BBC to be leading on the resignation of a man who's only been in Parliament for less than 2 years, whom virtually nobody in the country knows or has ever heard of before, from a position that nobody in the country knew he held, and that's the number one issue on the BBC, rather than the Article 50 vote itself, rather than the comprehensive thrashing that Corbyn gave the Prime Minister Theresa May yesterday in Parliament over the sweetheart deal with the Surrey Council over social care. These are big and real issues. The resignation of nobody from a position nobody knew he had, it's really not very big news, you know.
But will you ever see a Labour government ever again in your lifetime?
Well, I don't think anyone can say one way or the other. If the last 2 years proves anything, it proves that anything is possible. And everything that you thought was certain is not. Because there is a comprehensive revolt going on throughout the world against the political class. Against the political class that I described to you at the beginning of this interview. I, virtually alone, predicted Donald Trump's victory in May of last year. And when, as soon as the polls closed on the east coast of the US, I said on television and on Twitter that Trump was going to win, the sky fell down on top of me. I was deluged with foul abuse and told I was virtually insane for saying such a thing. And of course, a few hours later, it was clear that he was winning and did win. I said on television, as soon as the Sunderland vote was announced on the Brexit night, that's it. We're leaving the European Union. Again, another deluge of ignorant abuse. But again, I was right. And the reason I'm right is because I know what forces on the ground are producing these shock results. And the bubble, inside the bubble, or in the US inside the Beltway, prevailing orthodoxy is burst. The worldview of the prevailing orthodoxy is busted. And it's disappearing in front of our eyes. It's collapsing in front of our eyes. And all bets are off, including the bet on whether Jeremy Corbyn can be the next Prime Minister or not. So my truthful answer is, I don't know, and moreover, neither do you, and neither do any of the pundits or the pollsters or the political grandees of the mainstream political parties.
And on your program, Sputnik, last week, you had Peter Lilly as your guest, and you told him that people on the left and on the right, they're coming together against the progressive elite. Do you believe in that?
Well, I wouldn't call them progressive, I'd call them liberal. I do think that left-right divisions are becoming very difficult to discern or define by the previous definitions. For example, if you support Hillary Clinton, you support war with Russia, you support NATO, and you support the EU bankers' ramp, you're not left. You're just wrong. But so many of the people who support all of those things and people would define themselves as liberals, if not left. And they're not left, they're wrong. If you oppose these things, if you oppose Hillary Clinton, you oppose NATO's aggression against Russia, if you oppose the EU and its shameful treatment of scores of millions of people over the last few years of austerity and so on, you're not right wing, you're just right. And so these definitions are fluid, and there will be many political consequences of that, I predict.
And two last questions. You had your new documentary which came out in cinemas over summer, Killings of Tony Blair. So what revelation do you think that you made in that documentary that were new to the audience?
Well, in my experience all over this country and indeed the world showing the film, almost nobody knew everything about Tony Blair, and we have collated everything together in an important documentary, I think. Everyone knew he was making money. Nobody knew he made £100 million. Everybody knew that his love affair with George W. Bush had caused the world very serious problems, the end of which we will not see, even you as a young man in your lifetime. But when you bring them all together and present them in one document, my experience is that people are blown away by it. And that's why the film's doing so well across the world.
Absolutely. And final question, Robert Boothby, who was a maverick Conservative member of Parliament, in his memoirs he said that Churchill summoned him in his office and he said that either you need to do office or the showbiz. Which one would you go for?
Well, I don't think I'm going to be in office. If by that you mean a member of Parliament,
yes,
it's perfectly possible, and I certainly would not desist from being in Parliament as well as presenting television and radio shows. I have done in the past as both, and I would continue to do so. Obviously, if one is a minister, then one has to concentrate on that. But I have absolutely no expectation of being in office, at least anytime soon.
And what would you like to be remembered for?
As someone who always stood up for what they believed in, and who was almost always right. If I were writing a memoir now, it could be entitled, it wouldn't be, but it could be entitled, I was right about everything. I was certainly right about all the big things. And one of the joys of this period of history is that one is vindicated very much more quickly than one was in the past, when one would be long dead before people realized, yeah, he was right about that. Now vindication comes very quickly. I was, for the first time, portrayed on the front page of The Sun under a huge banner headline, "Traitor," my picture with the word "traitor" above it, in 1990, because I spoke on the back of a truck with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin. Nowadays, both of them are in and out of Downing Street and the White House far more often than I have been. In 1975, I made my stand with the Palestinian people at a time when it was roughly the equivalent today in shock public relation terms of declaring you were a supporter of ISIS. But now, 42 years later, there's hardly a person in the world who doesn't believe that the injustice suffered by the Palestinian people is central to world events. I made my stand against Tony Blair and George Bush over Iraq. Now you can't find anyone who will say that Bush and Blair were correct, and so on. I could give you much more, but it would seem immodest. But on all these big issues, I've turned out to be right. Me and people like me. I wasn't alone, but there were precious few of us. And so how will I be remembered? That's up to other people, but I hope at the very least people will say, well, he had the courage of his convictions.
That brings one to think of one of your hero, Tony Benn, who once said that I was once a national threat, but now I'm a national treasure, and you risk becoming one. On that note, thank you very much.
Well, I hope it's some years distant before I become a national treasure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We shall wait and see. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you.
It's good.